Well, I think that one of the things that impresses me right off the bat with respect to all of the photos in the exhibit is the change in ground cover in the canyon. When Lindbergh flew in 1929, this was following a period of intense cattle and sheep operations in the canyon, and there's, in many respects, almost no ground cover at all. This is particularly so around Pueblo Bonito in the aerial that Lindbergh has of looking down on Pueblo Bonito. The same thing is especially true of the photo of the Pueblo Del Arroyo, which is just a little bit to the west of Pueblo Bonito, where you can see the Chaco wash that has virtually no growth in it, and then the recent Adriel Heisey photograph that shows the dense tree cover that is now in the Chaco wash, as well as the sagebrush and other canyon growth on the bottom of the canyon. Looking at the photograph that Lindbergh took in 1929 of Pueblo Bonito, it's really interesting in a number of respects. This photograph was taken 2 years after Neil Judd completed 6 years with summer excavations at Pueblo Bonito, and what Judd managed to do was completely excavate this great house. At that time, this was the only great house that was completely excavated, and as a matter of fact, today it still remains as the only great house in Chaco Canyon that has been completely excavated. So it's very interesting to see 2 years after Judd finished how Pueblo Bonito looked at that time. I'm also struck by the fact that on the right-hand side of this photograph within Pueblo Bonito, there was a lot of white around the various kivas in Pueblo Bonito, and this represents the initial attempts that Neil Judd made to preserve this site. It was a kind of stabilizing of the ruin. He was using concrete, which is obvious with the white color, but nonetheless he recognized the need, once he had excavated this site, to preserve the site as much as possible, because clearly it was going to become even more of a major attraction to the public than it was at that time. The other thing that is really striking about this photograph, well, there are many things, but the thing that I notice mostly is that when Lindbergh was there in 1929 and took the photo, which incidentally was the same year that my father, Gwinn Vivian, was in Chaco Canyon in the University of New Mexico Archaeological Field School under Edgar L. Hewitt. So at this time, this great slab of rock against the cliff face behind Pueblo Bonito, which is very clear in Lindbergh's photo, was still standing. Essentially, it was this huge, huge piece of cliff which had separated from the cliff face and was standing by itself. That piece of cliff was known by the Navajos, well, Pueblo Bonito was known by the Navajos as the place where the rock is propped up. And this was because the Pueblo Bonitans had placed a lot of major posts under the slight cutting under of this slab in an effort to keep the rock up, and it worked, and built a wall at the base of it to also keep it propped up. And I think the thing that probably kept it there all that time is that they were also placing pajos or prayer sticks under the rock to keep it from falling down, and it didn't fall on Pueblo Bonito while they were living there. The Wetherells, who were there in the 1890s and early 1900s, for some reason called this rock the Elephant. But then the National Park Service, at some time, probably in the 1930s or early 40s, began referring to it as Threatening Rock, as it was this big slab of rock that was threatening to fall down on Pueblo Bonito. The earliest people at Pueblo Bonito who built the first part of Pueblo Bonito on the left-hand side in this photo, or to the west, actually placed that early building in the late 800s, the early 900s, away from that rock, so that there was no danger that that building that they built at that time could have been hit with the rock falling over. However, as this building expanded through major building episodes through time into the mid to late 1100s, that building moved further and further to the east, thereby putting it in front of threatening rock, or the elephant, or the propped up rock. And eventually, as we can see in Adriel Heise's photograph, that slab did come down. That was in January the 22nd, 1941. That rock came down after a very wet winter. It was one of the wettest winters on record. And in fact, the Park Service knew that this rock was moving. They were awfully afraid that it might come down. They were taking measurements at the top. They had rebar at the top between the cliff and threatening rock, and they were measuring the movement away from the cliff. And in the morning, like I say, January 22nd, 1941, it fell. We were living at that time on the other side of the canyon in the University of New Mexico Archaeological Field Station, and the custodian, the superintendents at that time were called custodians. The custodian's wife, Lorraine McKinney, wrote a letter to a number of friends, which was later reproduced. And in her letter to her friend, she said, "The ladies of the canyon were having tea at the Vivians this morning when the rock came down." My mother recalled that it was like an earthquake. They immediately knew what had happened because they knew the rock was moving. They all rushed out, probably 3 or 4 ladies, rushed out, and Mother said that they couldn't see anything on that side of the canyon because of the dust. It was just this enormous amount of dust, but the ground had actually shaken when it came down. So they jumped in the car and drove over, and then idiotically began climbing all over this broken rock, which was still pieces of it coming down. Fortunately, nobody was hurt. The rock eventually fully settled, but it did at that time take out the highest part of the back wall of Pueblo Bonito and took down or put rocks in about 30 rooms at that back portion of Pueblo Bonito, so that when you go today to Chaco and walk through Pueblo Bonito, the Park Service now has a station, a sort of a viewing area on a top of the fallen rubble of threatening rock, so that you can be a little above the plaza area of Pueblo Bonito, and at the same time be standing on the remains of the elephant or threatening rock. So we have a very valuable record of what an aerial record, the one taken by Lindbergh, of what that rock looked like and its position with respect to Pueblo Bonito. Just slightly up the canyon to the east is another very large Chacoan great house, the great house of Chetro. And when Lindbergh was taking the aerials in 1929, very little work had been started on Chetro. It was an interesting sort of little bit of a feud between Neil Judd, who was working in Pueblo Bonito, and Edgar L. Hewitt, who was at the Laboratory of Anthropology, Museum of New Mexico. The man held many, many jobs. And one of the things that he also did was teach at the University of New Mexico in what at that time was called the Department of Archaeology. My father was a student in that department, and Hewitt, even earlier in 1917, had come and had one field season in Chaco at Chetro, and this is what we see in this other aerial that Lindbergh has. But then when Neil Judd came into the canyon in 1921 to begin excavations at Pueblo Bonito, Hewitt really wasn't very receptive to him being there and decided to, after 1 year, cancel his field school in the canyon until after Neil Judd had left the canyon. Hewitt claimed, this was at least what my father said, that the dust from Judd's excavations bothered the students, and so Hewitt couldn't bring students to do work in Chetro, and so he canceled doing any work there until 1929. And it's interesting in Lindbergh's photo to see that in Chetro, the one structure that does appear to have been archaeological work done in it is the circular structure, a great kiva, in the plaza at Chetro. And this sort of reflects Hewitt's interest in great kivas. Hewitt wanted to be the first archaeologist in the Southwest to dig a Chacoan great kiva. But Earl Morris beat him to it at the Aztec ruin. So I think then that what Hewitt decided, if he couldn't dig the first one, he'd dig more than any other archaeologist could dig. And this is actually what he set out to do. He assigned his students projects to dig great kivas. My father, Gwinn Vivian, and a good friend of his, Paul Ryder, were assigned to start the excavations at the Great Kiva in Chetro. My father later excavated the isolated Great Kiva Rinconada. They also, Hewitt, one of his students, also dug a Great Kiva near the Una Vida Great House further east in the canyon at a site called Quinnahospas. So Hewitt dug a whole lot of great kivas, and what we can see in this photograph that Lindbergh had is that this was probably the first project that he was really focusing on in Chetro. Otherwise, there's very little excavation evident in this great house. Hewitt continued to dig there for a number of seasons, field seasons, summer field seasons, and cleared approximately a third of the Chetro Great House. It's really unfortunate in a sense that Hewitt was the one who managed to finally stop the excavations at Pueblo Bonito when Wetherill was digging there with support from the Hyde brothers. Because the collections from Pueblo Bonito were going back to the American Museum of Natural History, Hewitt felt that these kinds of collections should stay in the Southwest. And so he worked effectively to stop the work that the Hydes were doing at Pueblo Bonito. Then Hewitt continued his work at Chetro, but the unfortunate thing was that he virtually never published anything that he did at Chetro. So he closed down one operation at Bonito that in fact did produce a fair amount of published material. He in turn did a lot of excavating and published very, very, very little. So it's an interesting, what we have in Lindbergh's photo is a sort of a testimony to the way that Hewitt was focusing on great kivas and this site which was close to Pueblo Bonito but not right next to it. When Judd was digging, and another wonderful photo that Lindbergh has that we have is the Pueblo Del Arroyo, and this was also excavated partially. It's about 2/3 of it was excavated by Neil Judd when he worked at Pueblo Bonito. So Judd is responsible for two excavations at two major great houses in Chaco Canyon, and in fact, with the possible exception of Pueblo Alto, which the National Park Service did in the 70s, these two sites, Pueblo Del Arroyo and Pueblo Bonito, are about the only great houses which you can look at today, which have been excavated to a point where you can better understand the planning of the building and so on. At any rate, the photograph that Lindbergh took in 1929 shows the location of Pueblo Del Arroyo, right on the bank of the Chaco Wash, which is its name that was given earlier. It's the Pueblo of the Arroyo, the Pueblo of the Arroyo. And it also shows the modern in the late 1890s, early 1900s, buildings which were the Hyde Brothers Hotel, in a sense, a place the Hyde brothers, Talbot and Frederick Hyde, built when Wetherell was digging at Pueblo Bonito to house guests that came to the canyon and other personnel associated with the excavation of Pueblo Bonito and Pueblo del Arroyo. And finally, there is a really excellent photograph that Lindbergh took. This is an aerial in which he's a little bit to the east of both Chetro, Ketl and Pueblo Bonito. He's looking down the canyon with the Chaco Wash draining on the left-hand side of his photograph. You can see the shape of Pueblo Bonito pretty clearly near the top of the photograph, and then the outlines of Pueblo or of Chetro, Ketl closer to the bottom of the photographs. But what is interesting in this particular photograph is the white cross. It looks like a white line running down the photo, and then about midway, another white line going across. I don't know whether Lindbergh saw this cross when he had the photograph printed, or whether Judd looked at it. At any rate, we don't know of anybody making any inquiries into this, but essentially what we are looking at here is the location of a very large gridded field that subsequently was identified in other aerial photographs and represents one of the major kinds of farming that was done on the north side of the canyon. Essentially, people living in great houses were taking water off from the side canyons, and two of these you can see in Lindbergh's photograph, one right to the right of Chetro, Ketl, and then at the bottom of the photograph on the right-hand side, another drainage. You can see the eroded arroyo coming down and coming into the Chaco Wash. And what the Chacoans were doing, particularly those living in these great houses, was collecting that water as it came down. This was runoff. No water in Chaco Canyon is there permanently. So after major rains in the summer, water would run down these side canyons. Near the mouth of these side canyons, they had very large diversion dams that would then the water would be channeled into large masonry gates. That water in turn was put into smaller ditches and then run into this very large area of gridded fields. And since Lindbergh's time, more aerial photographs have been taken of these areas, and those gridded fields show up quite well in more recent aerial photographs. But Lindbergh, as far as I know, was the first person to get a photograph of this field, and historically, it's a very nice thing that we can see that those fields were actually, you could identify them from the air in 1929. So Lindbergh's photographs overall provide us for this part of the canyon with some really, really good material, both in terms of the history of archaeology in the canyon and in terms of the prehistoric Chacoan development over 300 years of several great houses in this part of the canyon.